Okay, perfect. So here's what we're going to do. I will just walk through all the paragraphs. I manage a few residential properties that my family or I own. So I have some like real world experience. I've probably been doing that for about, gosh, I don't know. Now it makes me sound old, like 12 years now. When I got my real estate license, my dad was like, congratulations, you get to manage this stuff. And at the time their properties were commercial and I was totally uncomfortable with that. So we eventually sold those and transitioned them into residential. And so we have a little portfolio that I've built for them that I manage. I used to manage properties for other people and it's like so painful. I do not recommend it. There's not enough money in it that's worth the hassle and the liability in my experience. So and that's not something that we want you to be doing at Briggs Freeman, under us, because it's a different type of liability insurance and all that good stuff. Okay, any questions about that? No. All right. So, parties to the lease are the landlord and the tenants. So when you have a lease listing, I think it makes sense for the landlord to draft the lease because then you're getting the terms that you want. I would say we had this happen recently where an agent said that the listing agent for the lease wanted the tenant to draft it, and it was just the landlord really knows what it is that they want the lease and how to pay. So really the landlord needs to draft it, but we drafted it because the listing agent was basically totally clueless. So I helped the tenant's agent draft it. But generally speaking, as the landlord, you want to draft it because you're going to know how they want to get paid, and we'll walk through why. So you put the parties, any resident over the age of 18 needs to fill out an application, but they may not all be applicants. But I would put, if it's a husband and wife, I would put there on there, anyone who's going to be responsible for the lease, I would put on here as a tenant, unless there's a guarantee and they're not going to live there. And that's a separate issue. So address, this is the street address, and then you do the legal address in whatever county. And then together with any following non-real property items, most of mine have a fridge and a microwave. So I always put that in there. If you're doing a washer and dryer or whatever, you would include all of these. Some of my, I've rented a couple of my personal homes that I kept as rental property, and we left the TV. So then we put the TVs on there, just to be clear, these were things that came with the property that belonged to the landlord. So primary term, this is when is it going to start? When is it going to end? And generally speaking, the tenant doesn't get possession until the date of commencement. Sometimes tenants will say, well, we don't want to start until, this has happened to me many times. They're like, we don't want to start our lease until February 25th. And then they start asking for the keys weeks early. And I'm like, well, if you want access to the space, you should be paying for the space, right? That will happen. Maybe not if another agent is involved, maybe that won't happen, but just you can be prepared for that. So delay of occupancy, tenant must occupy the property within 5 days of the commencement date. If they're unable to because of construction or prior tenants holding over, then the tenant has the right to terminate the lease by giving written notice before the property becomes available, and landlord will refund a tenant the security deposit in any rent. And if landlord was supposed to be fixing something and it got delayed, they'll abate the rent, right? So that's how that works if there's ever any delay in lease start. So this is an important paragraph for you guys as you're filling it out. So basically these leases, there's a start date and an end date. And if no one says anything at the end of the lease, they just renew automatically on a month-to-month basis. You have to give notice that you're moving out, even if you're moving out the date that the lease ends and you're not going to stay longer or stay an extra month or renew or anything like that. So oral notice of termination is not sufficient. So, the other part, they must give notice in writing. Does that make sense? This happened to me at the end of December. I had a tenant who emailed me. I think it was December. It was November. It was November 30th. And he's like, we're moving out at the end of the month. And I was like, well, our lease provides that you have to give me notice 45 days before. So technically you should be paying through January. And he was like, ugh. And then he ended up needing the time anyway. So he stayed. But that's how this works. And that this is where you check that box. You say, the lease will, if he hadn't given notice and I hadn't given notice, the lease automatically renews on a month-to-month basis until either party provides notice. And you check this box. They have to give written notice 30 days before the expiration date or blank. And I usually put 45. Sometimes that works against me if I forget that the lease is expiring on December 31st and I want them out, at the end of the lease, and I need to let them know, middle of November, right? And you can see here, time is of the essence. So we have to strictly comply with these dates. Does that make sense? So you can do it either way. You need to ask your landlord what they prefer. Does that make sense? Okay. The point is, someone has to, in order for any of these leases to end, someone has to give notice to the other party, right? Like, we are trying to sell some of our single family units right now, and I have a lease that ends at the end of April. So I need to remember in early March to give them notice that I do want them out at the end of April so that we can sell it vacant. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so if it renews on a month-to-month basis, it will continue to renew until either party provides written notice. And then, you know, when they give notice, they're saying, when is the notice effective? It's effective either on the last day of the month following the month in which notice is given. So even if they say, even if that tenant had said to me on, you know, November 30th, we're going to move out on January 2nd, he would have to pay through the end of January if you check this first box. And I usually check that box. That way we're not having to like calculate prorated rent. It's like, if you end up staying, you're paying for the whole month, even if you don't stay for the whole month. That to me is cleaner. It's right here in the lease. It's not confusing. So, and if a tenant reaches out to me and like has a question, then I always explain and then refer to them to the section in their lease, right? So that they can go back and read it. The other box you could check is just that it will terminate on the date designated in the notice, but not sooner than 30 days. So it's basically like a 30-day notice provision. It doesn't go through the end of the month. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. So rent. The monthly rent is blank. Tenant will pay it so that landlord receives it on or before when. So the monthly, this is where you put the rent amount. And then you say, it's due usually on or before the first day, generally speaking. And then that you say where they're going to pay it, landlord, listing broker, or property manager. You just check the right box. And then you say the first full month's rent is due and payable not later than blank in this format of payment. So there's different ways to approach this. The way that I do it as a landlord is that I want to collect the full security deposit and the full first month's rent, like up front. And then so if they're moving in on October 15th, I'm going to collect a full month's rent up front. And then on November 1st, instead of paying a full month's rent, they're just going to have to pay the prorated amount for October. And then their first full payment will happen December 1st. Does that make sense, guys? That's the way that I do it, because I don't want to have them pay me if they're moving in on, you know, October 27th, then in theory, it might be, if you didn't do it that way, you would be collecting upfront just their security deposit and like the 4 days of rent for October. And I prefer to have like, I prefer to know that they can pay me a full month's rent with like no big deal, if that makes sense. Are we feeling good about this or confused? Okay.
No, that makes total sense.
Okay, thank you. And then, you know, how is the landlord going to accept money from these tenants? Do they require a cashier's check, which is kind of painful? Do they do electronic payment? Well, can you just mail me a check? Like, what works easiest? I did send me checks for a while. And for me, that was very difficult because I am moving all the time and it's hard to keep track of checks. So I use apartments.com and collect payment through there, and the tenants can set up their bank account and it goes directly into my little property management bank account, and there's no charge. And for me, it's very, very easy. It lets you know when someone's paid. It lets you know if their payment failed. It lets you know how far behind. It'll automatically add late fees. I really like it. It's called apartments.com. It used to be something else, and then apartments.com bought them. So I like that. Is very easy for me because it keeps track of it for me. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not like a paid promoter or anything. I just think it's easy. So, and then this is where you put, you know, the prorated rent of X amount is due on or before what. So I would put, you know, the prorated rent of, if the rent was $3,000 a month, I'd put, you know, $1,500 if it was half, if they moved in on October 15th, and then I would put November 1st. And what I do is I send an email to the listing agent and the tenant or to the tenant's agent and the tenant. And that basically says like, this is what your payment schedule is going to be. Like before we execute, I'm going to get the security deposit, the pet deposit, and the first full month's rent, if that's applicable. And then you won't owe anything else until the first day of the month after you move in. And then you'll only owe a prorated amount. And then, so I lay it out for them so that it's like easy to understand. Yeah. if that makes sense. And then this is where you say, like, where are they going to pay? If they're mailing the checks, like, you know, to whom and where. I always put via apartments.com, and then I send them instructions on how to do it, and they set up their payment and it works fine. Does anyone have questions? Okay. So method of payment, tenant must pay all rent timely and without demand, deduction, or offset, except as permitted by law or this lease. Time is of the essence, of course, which means that strict compliance with due dates is required. And then this is how the tenant will pay. And you check, I always check electronic payment, but if they're mailing checks, if they require cashier's check, whatever it is, landlord may or may not charge a reasonable fee to process or accept payment by any of these, right? So if you're giving them a choice of electronic payment or personal check, and there's like a 1% fee for electronic payment, you can pass that on to the tenant here. And then landlord requires or does not require tenants to pay monthly rents by one payment. So that's if there are roommates who aren't going to pay together. If it's, I used to rent my house in Dallas to like these two 20-something-year-old guys, and they wanted to pay separately. And I was like, no, you guys figure it out and send me one payment. And that's how we did that. Oh, so Todd is asking in the chat, do you calculate the prorated amount by creating a daily rent amount, dividing the entire rent for the year by 365? No. So if the rent was $1,000 a month, and we were in January, which have 31 days, I would do 1,000, divided by 31. If we were in February, which had 28 days, I would do 1,000. It's just what's the per day cost that month, and that's how I would prodate. I don't do it by 365. And then Bernie says, can you email how to put it to the tenant on the first month? Sure. You want me to send you like a sample email of how I explain those payments work? Was that confusing? I will send you that language. It is a little bit confusing, but for me as a landlord, it's so much cleaner and makes sense. Okay, so this is important to know. If tenant fails to timely pay amounts due, or if the check is not honored, landlord may require tenant to pay such amount, any subsequent amount in certified funds. It does not limit landlord from seeking other remedies under the lease. And then this says there's no rent increases through the primary term, but landlord may increase the rent that will be paid during a renewal period by providing at least 30 days written notice to tenant. So in my example, so say I want to sell this property that we have, and the tenant's lease expires on April 30th. And yeah, April has 30 days. And I would need to let them know if I wanted to, even if we want the lease to go month to month, so if someone buys it and they want them to move out, if I want them to pay more, then I would have to let them know by, early March, before the middle of March, because March 15th in theory is the date. That sounds right, but that's 45 days before. I would have to let them know if I'm increasing their rent on a month-to-month basis. And then there's an extension of residential lease, and you don't have to extend it. You can just change the rent in that document. So that's what I would do. I was like, they're paying $1,600 right now. I could say for a month to month, if you want, or if they ask me, like, we don't want to sign a lease extension, we want to be month to month. And as a landlord, I want the security of knowing when my lease is going to end. I can say, that's fine. You can stay month to month, but it's going to cost you because I don't have the security as a landlord. So I want you guys to pay $1,750 if you're month to month. And they may be like, fine, because we're shopping for a house. And as soon as we find it, we want to be able to get out. Does that make sense? So there's just like strategy there or whatever. Okay. So hold on, I'm closing the chat window because it's covering my document. So, okay, late fees. So this was what happens if the tenant pays late. If the landlord does not actually receive a rent payment in full at the designated place of payment, by blank day of each month, tenant will pay landlord for each late payment. You can put whatever day you want in there. I don't think in Texas it can be less than 3. So don't ever put less than 3. I think they have to have at least 3. I think I put 5. I think I put 4. And then I don't have apartments.com charge them until the 5th day if I haven't received the rent. That's how I set it up. I give them like a day of grace period. And then it's like, what is my initial late charge? I always just put $50, but it's up to you guys. It depends on the price point, I guess. And then if there's additional late charges per day, and then additional late charges for any payment may not exceed more than 30 days. So once they're 30 days late, you can't keep like accruing on a daily basis. So, oh yeah, here it says the Texas Property Code prohibits assessing a late fee until rent has remained unpaid for at least 2 full days. So it has to be at least 2. So don't put less than 3, if that makes sense there. Okay. So for the purposes of paying rent and any late charges, so the mailbox is not the agent of receipt. So there's a law in Texas called the mailbox rule that as long as you put something in the mail and it's mail stamped, then it's considered received by the seller on the date of the mail stamp, even if the seller hasn't actually received it. And what this paragraph is saying is that the mailbox rule does not apply to rent. Like the landlord needs to have the rent by the second day or the third day or whatever number you put in there. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. So if this is a return check fee, you can figure out what the bank charges you and pass it on. I think I put $75 in there. But it doesn't really apply to me since we're doing electronic payments. So this is important. Regardless of any notation on a payment, the landlord may apply funds received from tenant first to any non-rent obligations. We're going to talk about these later, but including but not limited to late charges, return payment charges, repairs, brokerage fees, periodic utilities, animal charges, and then to rent. So if the tenant's writing you a check and they're really behind, or they have some fees that they owe you, this says the landlord has the right to apply those fees to the items that they owe you before they apply them to rent. So technically they might still be behind on rent because you're applying what they paid you to the other things that they owe you. Does that make sense? Yes, hopefully. Okay, so this is new in the change that they did last year. So there was a lot of questions about like service animals and pet agreements. And so the TXR has an animal agreement form, and we're not going to go over it today, although we can go over it in the addendums lease class if that's something you guys want. I don't offer it very often because it's kind of random, but if there's enough of you that want it, we can do it. But it basically says if you're going to have animals in the property, even temporarily, then the parties must agree in writing, but an assistance animal is not considered a pet, but is still required to be reported to the landlord with accompanying documentation as required by the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I'm not going to get into the details of what constitutes a service animal and how do you prove it, because it's like a whole huge long discussion, but we do have a nice little summary of what the law is there and what we have to allow as landlords. So I can share that with you if you guys are interested. So Todd says, if a tenant has a service animal, I understand that a pet deposit is not allowed, but can pet rent still be charged? I think the answer is yes. It gets pretty complicated. So I don't think you can treat, if it's a reasonable accommodation to allow someone to have a pet, I don't think you can treat them any differently than you would I know you can't treat them any differently than you would a regular tenant. So let me send you that little summary of service animals. That'll help. Okay. So in paragraph 9, if a tenant violates it and just brings an animal, then the landlord can automatically declare them in default and exercise their remedies, or charge them additional rent, like a blanket amount and then additional dollars per day. That's basically just a stick to prevent the tenant from bringing an animal on after the fact, is that the landlord can put an amount there. I usually put $350 and then $15 per day, but the question is, would that disincentivize people from bringing a pet if you find out and then you can charge them for it? So the landlord can also, this is important, remove or cause to be removed any unauthorized animal and deliver it to appropriate local authorities by providing at least 24 hours written notice to tenant of their intention to remove it, or charge to tenant the landlord's cost to remove it, exterminate the property, clean and deodorize, repair any damage. So it's pretty, this is a very, I usually start this way and I forgot to this time. This lease is very landlord friendly. So if you're representing a tenant, you need to encourage them to read it before they sign it. And you can't read it and like explain it to them because there's too much in here for you to just tell them all of this. Like you should tell them, like, you should read this so you know what your obligations are. As a landlord, you have a lot of rights in this lease, and this is one of them. So just be aware of that this is a pretty strongly drafted in favor of the landlord. And of course, it's written by Texas Association of Realtors, so it protects us as brokers too, as agents. So when taking any action, landlord will not be liable for any harm, injury, death, or whatsoever to the animal. So good to know, right? Okay, so security deposit. On or before the execution of this lease, tenant will pay a security deposit to landlord in the amount of blank, typically the 1 full month's rent, in whatever format that the landlord wants. And then security deposit is defined in the property code. Additional deposits that tenants pays to landlord other than security deposit become part of the security deposit. And basically they're talking about if you pay a pet deposit as well, which is how I do it. I don't charge an extra fee for pets because we're like animal lovers and I like renting to people that have animals. None of our properties have carpet in them. But do charge a pet deposit just in case they like eat the baseboards or scratch the floor or whatever. I think it's just important to have that. So refund. Tenant must give landlord at least 30 days written notice of surrender before landlord is obligated to account for refund of the security deposit. Any refund will be made payable to all tenants named in this lease. So what that means is that under Texas law, when a tenant moves out, the landlord has 30 days to return the security deposit or to return part of the security deposit and give an itemized list of items that were deducted for. So we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, but this is in black, highlighted, bold, conspicuous language. The property code provides that a tenant may not withhold payment of any portion of the last month's rent on the grounds that the security deposit is security. That tenant that I was telling you about that was like, I'm moving out at the end of December. He was kind of sneaky. And he was like, well, you have my security deposit, so I will not be paying last month's rent. And I was like, no. I was like, please read paragraph 10A1 of the lease or 10C1 of the lease, and like pointed that out to him. It says bad faith violations may subject a tenant to liability up to 3 times the rent wrongfully withheld and the landlord's attorney's fees. The property code, this is important. The property code does not obligate a landlord to return or account for the security deposit until the tenant surrenders the property and gives the landlord a written statement of the tenant's forwarding address. So your days don't start ticking until the tenant says, this is where I want you to send my security deposit, right? They need to give you the address. So just good to know. So surrender is defined later in the lease. What does that mean when they like give the property back? And then of course, this is where you can find the Texas property code online. So there's things that the landlord can deduct from the security deposit. It's a lot of things, and your landlord and your tenant should both be familiar with this. But they can't deduct for normal wear and tear, but they can deduct for all reasonable costs associated to repair the property. Like I just took back a property and the tenant, like all of the blinds were ruined. So I'm deducting the cost of new blinds from the security deposit because like all of the blinds are like broken and a disaster, and that's not normal wear and tear. And they were new when she moved in, so like blinds should last for more than a year, right? So costs for which tenant is responsible to clean, deodorize, exterminate, and maintain the property, and the tenant has a duty to maintain the property in like clean condition. We'll get to that later. So if you have to do like extra to clean it, you can charge them for that. I have a little extra special addendum, and I require the tenants to have the carpets cleaned because some of my properties used to have carpets, and also to professionally clean the property and provide a receipt to me before they move out. That way, if they don't, I can automatically charge them for the cost of professional cleaning. Unpaid rent, unpaid late charges, unpaid utilities, unpaid pet charges, replacing unreturned keys, garage door opener, security devices, or other components. These are all things the landlord can charge the tenant for. Removal of unauthorized locks or fixtures. If the tenant added extra locks and we want to fix that, we can charge them for the cost to fix that. Landlord's cost to access the property if made inaccessible by tenant. This happened to me once where I gave the tenant strict, very clear instructions about where to leave the keys, and they didn't do that, and I couldn't get into the property. So technically I could have charged them for the locksmith that I had to use, right? Missing or burned out bulbs, packing and anything that they leave. If you have to call a junk person to get rid of it, you can charge them for the junk person. Removing vehicles, the cost of reletting if the tenant is in default, attorney's fees, mailing costs with sending notice to tenant for any violation. So if you have a tenant who's chronically late and you have to send them regular mail and certified mail, which is what you have to do to give legal notice, then you can charge them for all of those. Just keep track of them and then charge them. So any other unpaid charges, cost to restore wall, flooring, landscaping, or any alteration. So if the tenant painted and they weren't supposed to, and you have to repaint, you can charge them for that. Damages to the property caused by smoking, cost to rekey certain devices. And then if the deduction exceeds the security deposit, I mean, good luck, but tenant will pay to the landlord the excess within 10 days after landlord makes written demand. So there's a lot of things that the tenant will pay for, or that the landlord can itemize in their return of the security deposit and say, like, I had to pay for all of these things when you moved out, so I'm only sending you back X amount of your security deposit. Does that make sense? Christy has a question. She says, what if tenant doesn't provide forwarding address and doesn't answer calls and calls landlords 3 months later for refund? Is landlord in violation? No, I mean, it's pretty clear. The language here, it says, and it's in bold and conspicuous language, right? The property code does not obligate a landlord to return or account for the security deposit until after the tenant surrenders the property and gives landlord a written statement of the tenant's mailing new address, after which the landlord has 30 days. So I mean, how long does the tenant have? Like, I don't know. I would assume if they ever get back to us, we have a responsibility, but I don't know. We'd have to like look into the Texas property code to figure that out. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so utilities. Well, let me scoot this over so I can see it a little bit better. So then this says tenant will pay all connections fees, service fees, usage fees, and all other costs and fees for all utilities. And for example, except the following which landlord pay. And a lot of times, like most of the leases that I have, the tenant pays all the utilities. I was just talking with an agent here about doing like a short-term lease for one of her clients. And I was like, if we're going to do a short-term lease, then I'm going to pay the utilities, because as a landlord and a property manager, it's a pain to like turn the utilities on and off temporarily. So I would just keep them on temporarily in my name and like pass the charges on. But typically the tenant's going to connect all the items in their name. And then landlord will pay. And then they'll pay, sorry. The only ones that you might want to put here is like if the landlord, sometimes we put HOA dues, right? If it's in an HOA, you can clarify, like obviously the landlord's going to pay the HOA dues. Not obviously, I guess that's negotiable, but I don't really think that's something that the tenant would typically be paying for. So unless provided by landlord, tenant must at minimum keep the following utilities on at all times the lease is in effect. So they can't move out a month early and turn these things off. And the reason that this is in there is because as a property manager, it is a huge, it's more of a pain to turn utilities on if they've been turned off. It's a lot easier to just switch them over, right? So that lease provides that they should have left them on through the end of the lease. So this is important. Before signing the lease, tenants should determine if all necessary utilities are available to the property and are adequate for tenants' use. So I would liken this to two things. One is like the speed of the internet is available, that's available, and two, like the water and the pressure. Like those are things that I am like, sorry, dude, like this is in the lease. Like you should have looked into these things beforehand. So, okay. Any questions about that? Okay. Use and occupancy. So tenant may use the property as a private residence only. The only people that are permitted to reside on the property during its lease terms are, and then this is when you, this is when you put in anyone on the property. So you can put like, if it's a family, it's like mom, dad, their ages, and then all the kids and their ages, right? So if you have like mom, dad, and like their 18-year-old son, and then their two 10-year-old twin daughters, you're going to put them all in there. And in terms of an application, I would have mom, dad, and anyone over the age of 18 is supposed to fill out a lease application for you. They don't have to be like tenant named on the lease, like up here as tenants. It can just be like mom and dad, but you do want them to fill out an application so that your landlord has just a record of like, who is this technically an adult that's living in my property, right? So tenant must properly inform landlord of any changes in tenant's phone numbers and email not later than 5 days after the change. HOA rules, whether not the property is or isn't an HOA. And then you put the name of the HOA if it is. And then this is important. Tenant must comply with owners association rules or restrictive covenants. They will reimburse landlord for any fines if there's violations and any administrative fees assessed by landlord agents. So that's important, just so that the tenant understands that if they break the rules, then they're responsible for it. Prohibitions, unless otherwise authorized by lease, these are things that the tenant can't do. They cannot install or permit any of the following: even temporarily spa, hot tub, above the ground pool, trampoline, any item which would cause cancellation of insurance coverage or increase in premiums. They cannot permit any part of the property be used for any activity which is a nuisance or is noisy, dangerous, etc. They can't repair vehicles. They can't run any type of business, including childcare. They can't have any activity which violates the zoning, an HOA rule or restrictive covenant. They can't do any obviously illegal or unlawful, including growing weed. They can't do anything that infringes with other people's rights near the property. And then they may not, this is important, this was a change in this new version. Tenant may not list any part of the property on any lodging or short-term rental website or with any person or service that advertises property for rent. So that's important. We saw that happening where people would rent properties and then they would put them on VRBO. The tenant would put them on VRBO. That's not okay. So Linda has a question. Shoot, Linda, what's up?
Can you hear me, or can I
No, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I have and I know this is, you don't write these things, but what about that first sentence? They can't install or permit any of the following that causes a suspension or cancellation of insurance coverage or the increase of insurance premiums. I kind of don't get why or can we, with the whole thing with the service dog issue or dog issue, and I guess it has to be very technical with it. What if they get a pit bull? I mean, my insurance will not, I got a pit bull breed. I have to have a certain insurance. The other people won't cover it. And I don't know how that works exactly with some of those things. And
Yeah, it's a good question. Your question, it sounds like, is basically, what if there's a conflict between like their service animal being an animal that causes like an increase in insurance premiums?
or a definite, yeah, something that has that will definitely pretty much, I don't know if it'll 100% get you canceled, but that insurance covered, and they might not be covered, and they kind of don't even know about it, or if they accept it, they know that that's a problem up front. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I would say that, as landlords, we're required by fair housing laws to provide reasonable accommodation, but we're not required to incur any additional expense to make that accommodation. So if your insurance is going to go up by X amount, then the tenant would be responsible for that, and you just have to let them know. Does that make sense? But yes, that's a confusing question of like if there's a conflict there. But if there's just an additional cost, then you probably would be able to find someone who could cover you, and you just have to say to the tenant, like, okay, well, if you want to move in here and you have a pit bull as your service animal, like I will make that accommodation for you, but then my insurance is going to cost this much and you are responsible for that cost, I think is how that works. And does that answer your question?
It does. And I just know because I have to cover this wonderful dog that's sitting next to me on my insurance. And very few insurance companies will accept a pit bull. And it's way more expensive. Now, granted, I'm a responsible pet owner, but if I had to take that, and I think if you remember a couple months ago, that's exactly what we had was, and I don't know if it's an HOA or something either, but I had somebody who had a service dog pit bull. And I'm like, really? Like,
Yeah.
So anyway, luckily they were kind about it, but I know some other people that just would not be and just don't want to get caught in a situation where,
Yeah. I would say if you run into that situation, call me and we'll like sort through it together to make sure that what we're doing like complies with fair housing and also makes sense. Christy and Todd are both saying that Todd's saying you can decline a tenant based on certain breeds. Christy is saying, I thought the ADA didn't allow service animals as an additional charge if a breed is a service animal with insurance. I don't quite understand what you're saying there, but
So, I guess my understanding was if a service animal is any breed, it wouldn't affect your insurance and you couldn't deny that animal unless they had answered the 2 required questions that you're allowed to ask them. It wouldn't matter what the breed was.
Yeah, this is where I don't want to. Yeah, and this is where I don't
understood.
know the law well enough there because I haven't had to deal with it. So I don't want to get into like the weeds of service animals. That's why I kind of also gloss over that section. If you get into this situation, like we can sort through it. So, and on the animal agreement, it does ask like what type of dog or animal it is. So,
I know you don't want to talk about the service animal much, but I'm struggling with the emotional support dogs. I had an investor client that I leased their house again. And this guy had all these letters from doctors, and there were 3 mutts of different size and ages and a big cat. And they were all service animals. And, I'm kind of struggling because a seeing eye dog is far different than his 3 mutts and his cat for emotional support. I'm not judging. I'm just saying, legally, I don't know, what, I don't want to get, I don't want anybody to get in trouble, but I want to be fair, but at the same time, some people push it. And I don't know legally what we have to, or I don't know how to advise my clients or on my own lease houses, what to do with that. I feel like it's really touchy and I kind of dance around it, but
I tell you what, Angela has put together this like awesome summary. I will send it to you guys. And then Dawn, you and I can like review it and talk about what's like the right answer. How does that sound? Because obviously you want to like comply with fair housing and people with like disabilities, but also obviously like if someone is like, I have 30 service animals, you shouldn't, that's not reasonable either. So
isn't that in the HOA as well? Like I think my HOA says no more than a couple, I mean, does that imply as well?
I mean, that's just the rule of the HOA. That just is what it is. Yes. So, and that's fine. Some HOAs do and we used to own a condo in downtown Fort Worth, and homeowners could have pets, but tenants weren't allowed to have pets there. They just weren't. And that was like, sorry, that's the HOA, that's the HOA's rule. And in fact, the HOA had its whole own addendum that they had to review the lease and incorporate that addendum into the lease before they would approve it. So anyway, okay.
Love
All right,
that
we're
HOA.
I know, right? We're gonna keep, it was a high rise and there was like a whole issue with like people not picking up after the dog and they did the whole like DNA thing and it, anyway, people should just clean up after their dogs. That was quite a lot of drama. I didn't live there anymore when all the drama was happening. So that was good. Okay. So I will send you guys that stuff on service animals and we can have a whole separate discussion about it if you want to talk about it. That's a good plan. Okay, so guests, this says, tenant may not permit a guest to stay because you don't want one person to qualify for the lease and then be like, this is my permanent guest, right? So you can say how long how many consecutive days they're allowed to stay. No guests are permitted to stay on the property more than twice the number of days in the space above in any 30-day period. If the above space is not filled in, 2 days per month will apply. They're basically just trying to stop you from having like a sneaky tenant, right? And I'm reading you guys this stuff just so that you're aware this is in here, but of course your clients need to read the lease. Okay, and then here's a good one too. Landlord is not obligated to pay any non-mandatory or user fees for tenants' use of any common areas or facilities. So if the HOA has like a pool, but there's like a use fee, then the landlord is not obligated to pay that. Okay, tenant may not permit more than blank vehicles, including but not limited to autos, trucks, RVs, jet skis, and boats, unless authorized in writing. So you need to figure out like how many parking spots are there truly, and then put that in there. They may not park or permit any person to park any vehicles in the yard, only in drives, garages, designated common areas, or on the street. They may not store or permit any person to store any vehicles on the street adjacent to the property. Like just to know that this is in here, right? In accordance with applicable state and local laws, landlord may have towed at tenant's expense any inoperative vehicle on or adjacent to the property, any vehicle parked in violation of this paragraph, any vehicle parked in violation of any local ordinance, and then tenant must properly, part of the application is you're going to get all the tenant's vehicle information. So the landlord could see like, yes, that's the tenant's vehicle, or no, this is not. And it's like always parked there. So just to be aware of that, it gives the landlord like a lot of power. Okay, access by landlord, advertising. This is important for you guys. Landlord may prominently display a for sale or for lease or similarly worded sign on the property during the term of the lease or the renewal. And then agents are allowed to take interior, exterior photos during the lease to lease or sell the property. So some tenants may not like that, but it is in the lease. Access, this is important, that before accessing the property, landlord or anyone authorized will attempt to first contact tenant, but may enter at reasonable times without notice to make repairs or to show the property to prospective tenants, buyers, inspectors, fire marshals, lenders, appraisers, or insurance agents. Additionally, landlord or anyone authorized by landlord may peacefully enter their property at reasonable times without first attempting to contact tenant and without notice to survey or review the condition and to take photographs to document it, to make emergency repairs, to exercise a lien, to leave written notices. Like if you're trying to evict the tenant, you're technically supposed to post the notice like inside the property somewhere. And so that's saying you have right to, you don't have to let them know, or to seize non-exempt property if tenant is in default. So like you can see here, like the landlord has a lot of ability to access the property even without giving notice. So just be mindful of that. Trip charges, if landlord or their agents made prior arrangements with tenant to access it and then they can't get in, they can charge a trip charge of blank. You have to decide what's fair. I put $75. I've literally never charged that, but you should put something in that blank. Okay, so this is important to us. Key box. A key box is a locked container placed on the property to holding a key. It's opened by a special combination or a programmed access device so that persons with access may enter the property even in tenant's absence. The key box is a convenience, but it involves risk. Neither the Association of Realtors nor MLS requires the use of a key box. So that's some CYA language and they want people to read it. Obviously, it's bolded. So then this is saying the tenant authorizes landlord or their property manager or broker to place on the property a key box containing a key during the last blank days of the lease or any renewal. So that's so that you can show the property to the next prospective tenants or maybe buyers, right? Is it the last 30 days? Is it the last 15 days? I mean, I personally, and I know we lose a little bit of money, but I don't show my properties while the tenants are still in there because usually it's like a disaster because they're in the process of moving out and I don't think it shows very well. And also I want to get them fixed and freshened up before I put them back on the market, because that's how I think I get top dollar, is by making them look really nice and clean and fresh. And then I can ask at the top of the market. So, but I have some vacancy, right? So that's like a strategic decision that I have made as a property manager. Your landlords may do that differently, but I still ask for the right to show it, during the last X days. And then tenant may so they're giving authorization up here. Then it says tenant may withdraw their authorization by providing written notice to landlord and paying landlord a fee of blank as consideration for their withdrawal. So the tenant may authorize it and then realize like, this is a pain and I don't want you to come for the last 2 weeks of of my lease because I'm moving out and I'm willing to pay you X amount. I always put the full month's rent because that's like paying for my vacancy. But then again, I don't do this anyway. So you can put any amount there that your landlord thinks is reasonable. But basically you would be saying to the tenant, well, I might have an extra month of vacancy if you don't let me show it at the end of your lease. So you're going to pay me a month to cover that vacancy, right? It doesn't have to be a month. It could be like a small amount. It could be like, okay, well, we'll sacrifice 2 weeks of showings for $300, right? Your landlord just has to decide what they want. So if landlord or landlord's agents are denied or not able to access the property, landlord may charge the tenant the trip charge. And then this is important. This is our CYA. Landlord, property manager, and landlord's broker are not responsible to tenant's guests, family, or occupants for any damages, injuries, or losses arising from the use of the key box unless caused by landlord, property manager, or landlord's broker. So that's protects us. That says we're not responsible for whatever happens. This is an important one, sight unseen notice. So I have done it twice now. And both times it was a disaster where I rented the property to people who hadn't seen it. And I will never do that again because they get there, there's problems, they don't like it. And then they're complaining to you. And it's like, you signed a lease, like, sorry, and I'm trying to be accommodating. And so ultimately we ended up like letting those people out, but that was just a pain for me, right? Both times. It didn't cost us money because I made them keep paying until the next tenant moved in, but it was just a pain for me to have to like release a property 5 months later when I thought that it was leased for a year. So, I don't do this. I don't let a tenant rent a property without seeing it anymore, but this is for that case when that happens. And sometimes it does. Tenant is given the opportunity to inspect the property prior to signing the lease. A tenant who declines to do so and chooses to sign it, sight unseen, does so at their own risk. They're accepting the property as is, and landlord is under no obligation to make any changes upon tenant viewing the property. They will be bound to all provisions of the lease. So that's just, you just need to know this is in here. So when someone's pushing back, you can be like, read paragraph. What is this? All my screens are in the way. 15A, right? So Todd's asking, is it true that even if you agree not to put on a key box, that doesn't prevent showings with the landlord agent present? Yes. And we will get to that. So landlords make no express or implied warranties as to the property's conditions. Tenant has inspected the property and accepts it as is, provided that landlord blank. And sometimes I'll tell the tenant, I'm going to have the lawn serviced one more time before you guys move in so that you get it in like nice, clean lawn. So we would write that in there, like, have the lawn mowed or whatever. It's whatever the landlord is agreeing to do, or have it professionally cleaned or whatever. You would put that kind of stuff here. So tenant will complete an inventory and condition form noting any damages to the property and deliver it to landlord within blank days after the commencement date. This is a form that as a listing agent, you should deliver to the tenant's agent or the tenant. That just is a form that the tenant can fill out saying like, there was a big crack in this tile and this wasn't working or whatever, so that a year later when they move out, we don't say, oh, they cracked this tile and now I have to replace it, right? So if they fill out this form and send it to you, then you have a record of what the property looks like. There's also a property manager's or landlord's version of that form that the landlord can fill out to help them remember what it looks like. I went to a property management class one time and they told me to go through and like take a video of the property before the tenants move in. And then you really do have like a record of what the condition was if you're going to like really nickel and dime the tenant and have them repair things. So that's just the best practice. And then please note that inventory and condition form is not a request for repairs. They must direct all requests for repairs in compliance with paragraph 18. Okay, move out. So when this lease ends, tenant will surrender the property in the same condition it was received, normal wear and tear accepted. They will leave the property in a clean condition, free of debris and any personal property. So you probably don't need that additional language that says that they'll have it professionally cleaned. That could be implied here, but I like that language because it says like, if you provide me the receipt, then I won't charge you for cleaning. But if there's no receipt, I'm automatically charging you. Because obviously you're going to have the property professionally cleaned in between tenants. I say that's obvious. To me, that's obvious. But okay, normal wear and tear means deterioration that occurs without negligence, carelessness, accident, or abuse. So surrender, this is the definition of surrender: when all occupants have vacated the property and one of the following event occurs: the date that tenant specifies as the move out or termination date and a written notice to landlord has passed, and or the tenant returns the keys and access devices. So that's what surrender means. Abandonment means that they vacated it in landlord's reasonable judgments, they're in breach, and landlord has delivered written notice to tenant by affixing it on the inside of the main entry door, or if they're prevented from entering by fixing it to the outside of the main entry door, saying that the landlord considers the property abandoned and if tenant fails to respond to the notice by the time required in the notice, which is at least 2 days. So that's if you get into a situation where like the tenants just ghost you, and then that's abandonment versus surrender, right? So you just need to be aware of that. Personal property left after move out: if tenant leaves any personal property after surrendering or abandon it, then the landlord may dispose of it in the trash, give it to charity, or sell it. And then tenant must reimburse landlord all of landlord's costs for doing so. So that's good to know, that if the tenant leaves it a mess with all sorts of junk, like you can charge them to get rid of it, or you can make money by selling it, I guess. So tenant's general responsibilities for maintenance: a tenant's expense must keep it clean and sanitary, promptly dispose of all garbage, supply and change heating and air conditioning filters. I always leave one spare in where they need to be changed so that the tenants can see the size. And then I periodically check in and remind them. Supply and replace all light bulbs, batteries for smoke alarms, et cetera, main appropriate levels of necessary chemicals or water softener, take action to eliminate dangerous condition, take necessary precautions to prevent broken water pipes. That's important. The tenant has the responsibility to disconnect hoses and cover, since we've had all these like crazy freezes lately. Remove standing water, know the location, operation of the main water cutoff valve and all the breakers, water the foundation, supply and change water filter systems, and then notify landlord in writing of all repairs. So that's a lot that's on the tenant, but it's nice that it's in the lease and you can point to it, right? Are all tenants going to do all of those things? No. So as a property manager or landlord, you need to protect your asset, but it's nice to know that those are in there. Okay, yard maintenance. This says like who's responsible for maintaining the yard. The tenant's going to water the yard. And then you check here, you know, landlord's going to maintain it, tenant's going to maintain it, or if the landlord has a service already, you can check this box and say tenant's going to maintain it with this contractor who we use. There's a pool addendum if you have a pool. Prohibitions: if tenant installs any fixtures on the properties or any unauthorized or unauthorized, such as smoke alarms, carbon detectors, blah, 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 satellite dishes, they become the property of the landlord, and tenant may not remove any part of the property or any of landlord's personal property. They can't change the locks. They can't make holes, except for a reasonable number of small nails used to hang pictures. They can't have water beds. They can't install additional cables. They can't alter the flooring. They can't paint. There's a lot of things that they can't do, right? So you need to be aware of all of these things. And then if tenant fails to comply with this paragraph 17, then landlord may exercise, in addition to exercising their remedies, landlord can perform whatever action that they're obligated to perform, and tenant must immediately reimburse the landlord for the expense. So that's good to know. If tenant's not doing these things, landlord can have them done or pay to have them done and charge it to the tenant. So this is where they discuss smoking, including vaping, whether it's permitted or not permitted, repair requests, all requests, sorry, I'm going fast because we're running out of time. All requests for repairs must be in writing and delivered. So this is important. If tenant is, it's important obviously because it's bold. If tenant is delinquent in rent at the time a repair notice is given, landlord is not obligated to make the repair. Good to know. In the event of an emergency related to the condition of the property that materially affects the physical health or safety, tenant may call landlord or the property manager at this number. Ordinarily, a repair to the heating and air conditioning system is not an emergency. So that's good to know. Like if they call you in the middle of the summer and they're like, our HVAC is broken and this is affecting my health and safety, just be aware that ordinarily that is not an emergency. So then this talks about like the timing of repairs. So if a landlord fails to repair a condition that materially affects the physical health or safety of a tenant as required by the lease, tenant may be entitled to exercise certain remedies under the property code. If tenant follows the procedures under those sections, then these remedies may be available. They can terminate the lease and get a refund. They can have the condition repaired and deduct from the rent the cost of the repair and obtain new judicial remedies. And then this is underlined because it's so important. Do not exercise these remedies without consulting an attorney or carefully reviewing the procedures under the applicable sections. We're getting into like slumlord stuff here, I would say, right? Where people are like, they didn't fix this forever, and so we fixed it ourselves. And it's very specific rules that tenants have to follow here. So this is important for just generally. The property code presumes that 7 days is a reasonable period of time for the landlord to make a diligent effort to repair a condition, unless there are circumstances which establish that a different time period is appropriate, such as the severity and nature of the condition and the availability of materials, labors, and utilities. Failure to strictly follow the procedures in the applicable sections may cause tenant to be in default of the lease. So that's good to know, right? Like 7 days. So if someone calls you and they're like, my hot water heater is broken, that gives us 7 days as a reasonable amount of time. Obviously, a tenant is not going to be happy to be without hot water for 7 days, but just good to know that that's in there, right? Completion of repairs. Tenant may not repair or cause to be repaired any condition, regardless of the cause, without landlord's permission. All decisions regarding repairs will be at landlord's sole discretion. And then the landlord is not obligated to complete a repair on a day other than a business day unless required to do so by the property code. This happened to me. We got off the plane in San Francisco and the tenants called me and they were like, our hot water heater out. And it was like Friday at the end of the day. And it was like, I will call a plumber, but they may come tomorrow. They may not come till Monday. But I always try to, I'm a nice landlord. I'm a sucker is actually probably the case. So I send my plumber out there on Saturday and paid extra, but payment of repair costs, except as otherwise specified in this lease, landlord will pay to repair or remedy conditions in the property and need a repair if tenant complies with the procedures for requesting repairs as described in paragraph 18. So this includes, but is not limited to repairs to the following items not caused by tenant's negligence: heating and air conditioning, water heaters, or water penetration. So landlord is going to pay for those items, right? If tenant has complied with the procedures. Landlord will not pay to repair the following items unless caused by landlord's negligence: conditions caused by the tenant or any of their guests, damages to doors, windows, and screens, damages from windows or doors left open, damage from wastewater stoppages, items that are cosmetic in nature, or the following specific items. So for me, like I rent my properties with TVs. If the TVs were to break, it's like, I'm not buying you a new TV. We'll just remove the TV and like patch it up. I just didn't want to remove my like TVs that were hanging on the wall. So you can put in there what the things you're not going to repair. Trip charges. If a repair person is unable to access, then tenant will pay the trip charge. And landlord may require advance payment of repairs if tenant is responsible, and tenant must promptly reimburse the landlord for amounts that they're responsible. So that's a lot of information, super fast, but just good to know that that's all in there. Okay, we're like only on page 11, so we're going to go real fast. So, but this is important, like security devices, and this is all required by the property code. The property code is very specific about the kind of locks, where the locks need to be, smoke detectors. As a landlord, and the property code changes, right? It gets modified on occasion. What I do is I call a company called Texas Rekey, and they are current with the law, and I will send them in between tenants and just ask them to bring the property up to code. And I just pay whatever it is, and I have them change the smoke detectors and check them. The reason that I do that is twofold. One, I am not good at keeping up what is the current law required by the Texas property code in terms of latches and locks and all of those things. And two, I like the peace of mind knowing that I hired a third party to do that. So if there ever were an issue, I can say like, I was responsible. I hired a professional company to make sure we were up to code. So if something failed, that's not really my fault. It was not my negligence. I hired a company to do this. That's not a Briggs Freeman stance. That's just a Zareen property manager. Like that's the way I do it. I really like them. Rekey, they're really fast. They'll go there and do it all. You don't even have to be there, and just leave the new keys in the combo lockbox. It's super convenient. So any questions? All notice or request by tenant for rekeying. blah, 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 must be made in writing. Installation of additional security devices desired by tenant must be paid by tenant. So sometimes if you have a tenant that's like, well, we want a security camera at our front door, they need written approval by the landlord. And you have to remember in the paragraphs above that it says that that becomes the personal property of the landlord. So they're paying for it. The landlord's going to benefit from it, and they have to have permission from the landlord. So if tenant vacates the property in breach, landlord may deduct from the security deposit reasonable costs to rekey. So that's was something when I had those tenants that moved out early, like we all agreed they would pay for the rekeying because you want to rekey in between tenants. Okay, so then this is smoke alarms. We talked about that. The property code is very specific, so just be aware. So liability, this is a good general coverall for the landlord. Unless caused by landlord is not responsible to tenant, their guests, blah, 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 for damage, injuries, or losses caused by fire, flood, water, leaks, snow, hail, winds, et cetera, or other occurrences or casualty losses. Unless prohibited by law, tenant will promptly reimburse landlord for any damages caused by tenant, their guests, or any animals, including costs of repairs to service to the property. Again, this is just protecting the landlord, right? Protecting them, saying we're not responsible if you have damage as a result of these things, and also saying if the tenant damages something, the tenant is responsible. So holdover, this says if the tenant fails to vacate, then tenant will pay landlord for rent for the holdover, and indemnify landlord and future tenants for damages, including but not limited to lost rent, lodging, cost of eviction, and attorney's fees. So if you have a tenant scheduled to move in and the previous tenant doesn't move out, and the tenant moving in is like, I need a hotel because I just moved out or whatever, technically you can charge your original tenant for that, right? Rent for any holdover period will be 3 times the monthly rent calculated on a daily basis and will be immediately due and payable. That's pretty intense. And then this is important, residential landlord lien. This is from the property code. Landlord has a lien for unpaid rent against all of the tenant's non-exempt personal property and may seize such non-exempt personal property if tenant fails to pay rent. And then the property code governs this lien. Landlord may collect a charge for packing, removing, or storing property seized in addition to any other amounts, and then they can dispose of it. We talked about that earlier. So this subordination clause basically says that this lease and the tenant's leasehold is subject to is subordinate to the mortgage, right? If the landlord has a mortgage, then the tenant's interest is subject to that. This is just what our mortgage companies want to see. So casualty loss. This section of the property codes governs the rights and obligations of the party if there's a casualty loss, meaning like a fire, tornado, anything like that. Any proceeds paid because of a casualty loss will be the landlord's sole property for the purposes of this lease. Any condemnation is a casualty loss. Okay, so then this is the default. It says if landlord fails to, this is where you're telling your tenants, like, you need to get renter's insurance, right? This comes later, but this is another place to remind that, like the tenants need rental insurance. Okay, so default. If the landlord fails to comply with lease, tenant may seek any relief provided by law. It like gives no help to the tenant, right? Of what like landlord's default might constitute. But tenant's default is spelled out quite clearly right here, right? If they fail to pay all amounts due, tenant will be in default, and then this tells what the landlord can do. They can terminate their right to occupy. All unpaid rents are accelerated. That means they owe the whole amount. They can exercise their landlord lien. All amounts bear interest at the rate of 18%. Tenants liable for lost rent, landlord's cost to be let. I mean, we're throwing the book at them of all the things that the tenant is responsible for if they're in default. But it gets pretty complicated. And if you have a landlord in this situation, I'm going to say they probably need an attorney to help them. And I have a great attorney to refer them to. It just gets really complicated. So notice to vacate may be by any means permitted. If tenant vacates the property, guys, sorry, I just looked up. It's 10:01. If you want to drop off, that's totally fine. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I realize this is not like super fun. We probably have like less than 10 minutes more if you want to keep going through, but I'm going to repeat that if you want CE credit, please put your name and license number in the chat, and then you can Venmo CG Partners, putting that in the chat, and put your license number in the chat. So you can hop off if you want to, but please, if you want CE credit, because we've been here for an hour now, put your license number and your name in the chat. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so tenant property in breach, landlord may deduct from the security deposit the reasonable cost to rekey. Landlord will attempt to mitigate any damage or loss caused by tenant's breach by attempting to relet. So you can't you can't say, if the tenant like moves out 4 months early, you can't just be like, oh, well, they're paying me rent, so I don't have to worry about it getting it leased for 4 months. Like you have the duty to relet it as soon as you can. But of course, you can still collect all these other charges for them. So early termination, I get asked this a lot. There are very, very, very few circumstances under which the tenant has the right to terminate the lease early. It begins on the commencement date, it ends on the expiration date, unless extended or terminated by written agreement by parties or under this paragraph. Unless otherwise provided by law, tenant is not entitled to early termination due to voluntary or involuntary job or school transfer, changes in marital status, loss of employment, loss of co-tenants, changes in health, purchase of property, or death. So that's good to know. The tenant is still responsible under, Todd, it's in the chat. If you just scroll up a little bit, it's CG Partners. He was asking what the Venmo was. Oh, the Venmo is $10. So these are the cases under which the tenant does have the right to terminate. If there's like a family violence issue or military transfer, certain like sex offenses or stalking, like that might be a reason. Again, if they become deployed. So that's another one. Family violence, stalking, it's very clear. So these are the only circumstances under which a tenant really has the right to terminate by law. Obviously it happens sometimes where tenants want to terminate early and they don't have the right. And what we do is we just try to work with them, right? But you can see that this lease is very friendly to the landlord and basically provides that all of the landlord's costs are covered by the tenant until that can happen. So assignment, tenant may not assign or sublet without landlord's consent. If they request early termination, they can attempt to find a replacement tenant and may request landlord to do the same. Any assignee, subtenant, or replacement tenant must be acceptable. They must sign a new lease or a sublease or an assignment of lease, but the landlord has to approve them. And then this discusses commissions. And what I usually put here is I just put this, I check this blank and I put a full month's rent, and I check this blank and I put a full month's rent, because that's the reletting fee. The realtors are want to get paid commissions. And so you want to make sure that that's covered. That's how I do it. Okay, attorney's fees. Any person who is prevailing party in any legal proceeding brought under or related to the transaction described in this lease is entitled to recover attorney's fees. That's good to know. Representations. You'll notice here that this is one-sided. There's no representations from the landlord, but the tenant is saying that all of this says that all tenant statements in the lease and in their application are material representations, and each party that is of legal age to enter into contract. If tenant makes a misrepresentation, then the tenant is in default. And then these are all the different addenda that we would go over in the next class. If you guys are interested in that class, either put it in the chat or send me an email and let me know, because I don't usually offer it, but if there's enough people interested, we could go through all of these forms and talk about how to use them and what are really the mechanics when you're like signing a new lease. So this says all notices of this lease must be in writing and are effective when hand delivered, sent by mail, or sent by email. Do not insert an email address unless they're consenting to receive legal notices. And so this says tenant at the property. So we have to give them notice at the property. And then this says where we want our legal notices as the landlord. Okay. So now we're down to just boilerplate terms. There are no oral agreements. This lease is the entire agreement. This lease is binding and inures to the benefit of the parties and their heirs. Joint and several, all tenants are jointly and severally liable. Like I said, if I had those two guys living, if one of them have moved out, the one that remains is still responsible for all of it. Waiver, landlord's past delay waiver or non-enforcement of a rental due date or any other right will not be deemed to be a waiver of any other breach by tenant. So even if you've been like a relaxed landlord, that doesn't mean that you've like waived your rights to start enforcing the lease. Severability, if the court finds any clauses in here were unenforceable, then they could just remove just that one. The whole lease isn't void, just that paragraph is. So it's governed by the state of Texas, the laws of the state of Texas. Only Texas realtors are allowed to use this. So be aware of that. And then, future inquiries about this lease should be directed to the person listed for receipts of notice under paragraph 32. It's tenant's responsibility to determine before signing this lease that everything is satisfied. That's a repeat of an earlier term. The brokers to this lease have no knowledge whether the landlord is delinquent. So that's a CYA for us. We don't know that we have no idea that our landlords might be in default on their mortgage. we can report to credit agencies. The landlord is not obligated to respond to any request for tenant's rental and payment history from a mortgage company or other prospective landlord unless tenant has given notice of termination and tenant is not in breach. And then this says if the tenants were to die, who's their content. And then this says if the tenant is the sole occupant and dies, like what happens. This is puts in the lease. This covers us as realtors, just saying where to find sex offenders, right? And then this is where we're advising them to get rental insurance. And then this is saying who's gonna manage the property. You know, landlord's broker Briggs Freeman will not act as the property manager. And then it's like, who is going to be the property manager? And you put that contact information in here. Okay. So that is it. And the only provision that we didn't cover is showings while it's for sale. I think we did talk about that, but does anyone have any specific questions? No? Okay. Well, I have everyone's.
I have one, Zarina, I have one question. This is Marilyn.
Hey.
Hey, good morning. I have a property that I'm about to lease and the doorbell doesn't work. I just realized that. So I was wondering about your advice on putting like a camera, you know, Ring device, for example, on there, and then how problematic that is later when somebody moves in.
You would add the Ring device because you want to use it or because you want the
Yeah.
tenant to use it?
I mean, yeah, kind of. The street is kind of a busy street.
Mhm.
I was wondering, what would you advise that? Would you think just put in a regular doorbell and?
Well, I mean, are you wanting the Ring device right now for you?
Well, I mean, I could. I mean, the doorbell doesn't work, so I'm like faced with like, okay, I need to get a doorbell anyway. So,
I mean, this is Zareen personally, like as a property manager, I always make the properties kind of like bare bones. And to me, a Ring doorbell is kind of an extra. So
yeah, it is.
unless you personally want it, I would just put in a regular doorbell. And then if the tenant ever wants it, you can say you can install it, but read the lease, like it will become mine.
Right. Okay. All
That's
right. Just
probably
getting
what I
your personal advice. Yeah. Okay.
No, happy to do it. All right, guys. It's CG Partners is a business account. So if you can't find it in Venmo, you have to switch from people to business and then it'll be there with my picture. Had an agent asking. Okay, thank you for sticking around. I hope that was helpful. I know I talk fast and leases are like kind of boring. So sorry. I will send the sample like explanation of how I collect the payments and prorate. And I will also send the animal service stuff that Angela has gathered that's really, really good. I hope that was helpful. If y'all ever have questions about this stuff, call me. Okay.
Hey,
Thank
Zareen,
you.
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah. What's up?
So is it discrimination if I guess if there's like, let me back up. So you have 3 people or 2 people that want to lease the house and their income completely together makes up 3 times the rent or whatever that requirement is. If they don't make, if it's only like my son and daughter-in-law rented their house and they were boyfriend, girlfriend. Well, the girlfriend ended up leaving. He actually did have enough money to pay for the rest of it, but in a situation where he might not and had to have a different signer. But are we discriminating against if we can't say like we don't want a roommate situation, or we've got 4 people that want to rent the house and we don't want that. They really want a family, which is the opposite of fair housing. But can we discriminate in that way? And it sounds like discrimination, but if someone doesn't have the ability or one of the primary people don't have the ability to pay that rent 100%, is that a stipulation that they can make?
Yeah. So this is a great question. There's a form and it's actually in BF office. It's called tenant selection criteria. And I would advise, so we didn't talk about this. I think it's actually a great question. I would advise when you're accepting applications, I use a service called ctcredit.net that I just to run people's screenings. Briggs Freeman recommends a service called My Smart Move. And I actually really like that service because it puts you as the agent out of the middleman. it basically
I have
allows.
both though.
Yeah,
I have the
My
CT
smart
credit
move is
too.
nice because the landlord can get the information from the tenant directly and make the decision. As the agent, you don't want to be in the middle saying, well, this person looks pretty qualified, and then 2 months later they're in default and the landlord's like, great job, right? So I like my smart move to recommend to our landlords because it puts them in direct contact with the tenant and we're not the middleman saying whether we think they're good candidates or not. Like the landlord needs to decide that, right? So
But
that's the
upfront, if
first.
they don't accept an application, like, okay, you have these two people, they want to live together and totally a roommate situation.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've seen people
Yeah.
say no roommate situation. I just don't know if that's
I would say, familial status is a protected class, so I
Right.
don't know, I would hesitate to say that. But what I would do is for your example, like sorry, it's a very long answer to your question. There's a document called tenant selection criteria, and it spells out very clearly, like what you're going to be reviewing and like the criteria by which the tenant will be approved or denied. And you need to deliver that to them. I don't want to say this wrong, but I think that if you don't deliver that to them and you collect an acceptance fee, an application fee, and then you reject them, they can request for their application fee to be returned because they didn't understand the criteria under which they were being judges.
I
So-
make them I make them sign
Yeah.
something like that. Most of it came from whatever association, but I also added a few things at the end, kind of like we
so
were
it's-
saying, like,
Yeah, it's called
So-
tenant selection criteria. So you may be like,
Yeah.
my landlord's only comfortable if their income, if the rent doesn't exceed 20% of their income, right? I think the general rule of thumb is like 30, but your landlord may be like, I want to make sure they have plenty of income, so we're only going to accept them if it's 20%, right? So you're just giving them the terms under which you'll accept. Obviously, you can't discriminate. I would hesitate to say no
People-
roommate situations.
I've had people tell me, like, when we're running no roommate situations, they're not doing a roommate thing. And I think it's kind of, it's so,
I would
just
not
like
do
that
that.
situation.
I think that sounds like a fair housing violation to me.
Yeah, I agree. So I had to deny him for 5 other reasons.
But
Well, if you've given them tenant selection criteria, there's usually a reason you could probably. find.
Right.
some
Yeah.
HOAs, you might be able to get around it. So I have a house up in Paloma in Little Elm, and the HOA, I forgot how it's worded, but it says there's not multifamily in there. So there could be, they actually define what it is and relative, I forgot what it is, but you can check in the HOA too to see, because sometimes they consider that multi and you might be able to use the HOA. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a big risk as a landlord. If there's even if a couple that just started dating and one of them can't swing on their own, I would rather not take them, obviously. Right or wrong, it's a higher risk to me, but it's sticky. That's what, when I was talking about service animals, it's the same thing with this. If like unmarried couples that are young or, it's definitely measured risk.
As a general rule, like I think if you can talk to people on the phone, you can usually get a pretty good feel for, whether they're going to be good tenants or not. I will say that. And I also think, that's the hard part about being a landlord, is that we are dealing with human beings. That's what I told you, those people that I rented that property to sight and seen, like, I had talked to the girl extensively. She was so sweet. Like, I was like, they'll be great tenants. And then like their relationship dissolved and they just like couldn't make it work. And then I worked with her, and that's just like the sad, hard part about being a landlord. Sometimes you just have to be careful about the discrimination, right? So tread lightly. And if you're ever in a situation you want to talk it out, just call me and we can talk through it together. Okay. All right. Anyone
Thanks.
have?
Thanks, Serene.
That's like medium helpful. Sorry. I wish it was
No, I
more
appreciate
black
it.
and white.
We need
Um,
an advanced class with some of those really crazy
But yes.
questions.
Exactly. All right. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you.